In week 3 of this course, we looked at what kind of impact the First World War, or the so-called Great War, had on collective memory, especially in Great Britain. We saw that the conflict was mostly represented in a negative tone, and this kind of representation shaped the broader public's perception of that war. Less than 21 years after the end of the Great War, another far more destructive global conflict broke out. For the next 2 weeks, we will look at how the Second World War has been remembered. We will explore the paradox of the Good War, a term used to describe the Second World War which was adopted by the victorious Western Allies, specifically the United States of America. On 1 September 1939, Nazi Germany invaded Poland, forcing Britain, France and other minor allies to declare war against Germany. Initially, Hitler and the Soviet Union's Joseph Stalin agreed not to attack each other's country. Instead, under the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact of August 1939, Germany and the Soviet Union partitioned Poland and marked out their spheres of influence across Finland, Romania and the Baltic states. From late 1939 to early 1941, in a series of campaigns and treaties, Germany controlled much of continental Europe and formed the Axis alliance with Italy and Japan. On 22 June 1941, Hitler double-crossed Stalin as the Nazis led European Axis powers in an invasion of the Soviet Union, opening up the Eastern Front, which was the largest land theatre of war in history, and bogging the Axis powers down in a war of attrition. Up until this point, the United States still remained neutral, even though it sent arms shipments to Britain and the Soviet Union. Then, in December 1941, Japan attacked American and British territories with near-simultaneous offenses against Southeast Asia and the Central Pacific, including an attack on the US naval fleet at Pearl Harbor on 7 December, which forced the US to declare war against Japan. The European Axis powers declared war on the US in solidarity with Japan. Japan soon captured much of the Western Pacific, but its advances were halted in 1942 after losing the critical Battle of Midway. Later, Germany and Italy were defeated in North Africa and at Stalingrad in the Soviet Union. The Axis powers suffered key setbacks in 1943, including numerous Allied offensives spearheaded by the US in the Pacific, which cost the Axis powers the initiative and forced it into strategic retreat on all fronts. In 1944, the Western Allies invaded German-occupied France, while the Soviet Union regained its territorial losses and advanced towards Germany and its allies. During 1944 and 1945, Japan suffered reversals in mainland Asia, while the Allies crippled the Japanese Navy and captured key Western Pacific islands. On 8 May, the war in Europe ended, following the liberation of German-occupied territories, the invasion of Germany by the Allies, the fall of Berlin, and Hitler's suicide, culminating in the unconditional surrender of German forces. However, the war in the Pacific would still continue. Following the Potsdam Declaration by the Allies on 26 July 1945 and the refusal of Japan to surrender unconditionally, the US dropped the first 2 atomic bombs on the Japanese cities of Hiroshima on 6 August and Nagasaki on 9 August 1945. Faced with an imminent invasion of the Japanese archipelago, the possibility of additional atomic bombings, and the Soviet entry into the war against Japan, Japan announced its intention to surrender on 15 August and signed the unconditional surrender document on the 2nd of September 1945, cementing total victory in Asia for the Allies. It's estimated that between 60 and 70 million people died during the Second World War, with about 40 to 50 million of that number being civilians. This scale of death and destruction in such a short space of time was and still remains unprecedented. However, despite the horrors of this war, it's often referred to as the Good War, particularly by those in the US. In 1984, American author Studs Terkel compiled an oral history of the Second World War titled The Good War. The text consists of a series of interviews with various men and women from across the globe who directly experienced the events leading up to, including, and following World War II. Loudon Wainwright, writing for the New York Times, stated in a review published on the 7th of October 1984, 10, 20, 30 years from now, the best witnesses to World War II will be largely gone, but presidents honoring them will surely have access to a copy of Stutz Terkel's most recent exercise in memory harvesting. In 1985, it won the Pulitzer Prize for general non-fiction. In a note at the beginning of the book, Terkel explains that the title is a phrase that has been frequently voiced by men of my generation to distinguish the war from other wars, declared and undeclared. A decade later, a study of World War II by Michael C.C. Adams called The Best War Ever was published, and in 1998, the prominent television journalist Tom Brokaw declared America's World War II generation to be the greatest generation any society has produced. In his book, The Greatest Generation, Brokaw profiled those who came of age during World War II, specifically in the United States, and argued that the men and women represented in his book fought not for fame and recognition, but because it was the right thing to do. But what is the meaning behind the phrase, the good war? Why would anyone call any war good? Samuel Hines notes that this phrase never became an oxymoron, not even at the end, though by then 60 million human beings had died. So, why the good war? There were many narratives that stemmed from this phrase. Dwight D. Eisenhower, American general and supreme Allied commander during the war, called America's participation in the war as a God-inspired moral crusade to protect democracy and religion against the Axis tyranny. When soldiers asked him why they were fighting, the simplest and best answer he could give was that they were defending a free way of life, free education, freedom of speech and worship, free enterprise, free homes, which rested on a religious foundation. To some soldiers, the war was seen as an opportunity to do something good, to be part of something good, and stand up against the forces of evil. In the words of one soldier, to see fascism defeated, nothing better could have happened to a human being. This sentiment was perpetuated in the works of historians who lived through the war and wrote about it. For example, British historian A.J.P. Taylor wrote in his English History 1914 to 1945 of 1965 that no soldier who saw the German murder camps at Dachau or Buchenwald could doubt that the war had been a noble crusade. The official US narrative held that there was moral certainty that derived from a sense that it was America's duty to rid the world of the evils of German Nazism and Japanese militarism. These enemies presented immediate threats to American values and security. Americans did not seek the war. Instead, they responded to an unprovoked attack. It was their duty as a great power to safeguard democracy and its responsibility to protect humanity. The narrative continues that Allied victory would have been impossible without the US's financial and military contribution to the war. With the help of US intervention, German Nazism and Japanese militarism were utterly crushed and discredited, and after the war, American generosity lifted those same nations from the ashes, reshaped them in its image of democracy, and contributed to their economic recoveries. The US prospered at home and assumed its rightful place as the world's greatest power. This narrative fits in neatly with Brokaw's claim that the American servicemen and women of that era made up this grand, monolithic idea of the greatest generation. But Brokaw himself, as a journalist, was not that ignorant to believe such a grand myth. He knew World War II was a complex event in which the US as victors were at times as much the perpetrators than the liberators. There were many instances where US forces were as brutal as their enemies. For example, Very few Japanese soldiers were taken in as prisoners of war by US forces during the Pacific Campaign, though this was justified in the eyes of US generals and the American public at large because Japan was the aggressor with its attack on Pearl Harbor, as well as Japanese brutality inflicted upon American, British and Australian prisoners of war. The notion of the Good War was compromised in other ways as well, particularly by the Allied bombing campaign that destroyed entire German cities, such as Hamburg in July 1943 and Dresden in February 1945, where women and children were killed in firestorms created by Allied incendiary bombs. So the victorious Allies' own complicity in atrocities is minimized or simply overlooked. Similarly, the first use of atomic weapons in anger was by the US military, not the evil instigators of the war. Thus, Brokaw consciously simplified this complex reality to promote a myth. He drew inspiration from acclaimed American historian Stephen E. Ambrose, who became increasingly selective in his work on World War II, placing emphasis on the good of American virtues rather than framing a more complete picture. Both Brokaw and Ambrose contributed towards what Giovanni Giolitti called a beautiful national legend of World War II, as the Good War myth continued to grow following the end of the war, with a plethora of books, film, and political rhetoric. So, how is such a legend or myth constructed? Adams explains that myths are ways we try to shape a usable past to help in directing present actions and setting our future course. They are constructive unless, in narrowing our focus, we stray too far from the complex patterns of history and begin weaving fantasy. In World War II, only positive aspects of the war received mainstream attention, setting a pattern for interpreting the war's meaning. The process was simple. Information about the war was filtered by each participating country before the information reached its public. All reports of military disasters and atrocities by their own side was suppressed. This process took form in various ways, namely official discourse and propaganda, selective coverage and censorship, public relations and advertising, Hollywood hype, and commemoration and memorialization. During 1940, US President Franklin D. Roosevelt, stimulated by a press conference in which he discussed long-range peace objectives, started collecting ideas for a speech about various rights and freedoms. In his annual message to Congress on the 6th of January 1941, he asked the American people to work hard to produce armaments for the democracies of Europe, to pay higher taxes, and to make other sacrifices. He also envisioned a better future founded upon 4 essential freedoms. These were freedom of speech, freedom of worship, freedom from want, and freedom from fear. Now, this speech was made 11 months before the Pearl Harbor attack. Roosevelt's speech largely focused on the national security of the US and the threat to other democracies from a global conflict that was being waged across the continents. In that sense, he made a break with the long-held tradition of US non-interventionism. The speech coincided with the introduction of the Lend-Lease Act, which promoted Roosevelt's plan to become the arsenal of democracy and support the Allies, mainly the British, with much-needed supplies in the form of aircraft and armaments. The speech would later establish what would become the ideological basis for US involvement in World War II, framed in terms of individual rights and liberties that are portrayed as the hallmark of American politics. The Declaration of the 4 Freedoms became the foundation of America's war aims and the center of all attempts to rally public support for the war. With the creation of the Office of War Information in 1942, as well as the famous paintings by painter Norman Rockwell, the freedoms were advertised as values central to American life and examples of American exceptionalism. Rockwell did a series of paintings illustrating the 4 freedoms as international war goals that went beyond just defeating the Axis powers. Rockwell translated the abstract concepts of freedom into 4 scenes of so-called everyday American life. The paintings were reproduced in the Saturday Evening Post over 4 consecutive weeks in 1943, alongside essays by Booth Tarkington, Will Durant, Carlos Bulosan, and Stephen Vincent Benet. The paintings later became the highlight of a touring exhibition sponsored by the Post and the US Department of the Treasury. The exhibition and accompanying sales drives of war bonds raised over $132 million. After the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, the US government called upon manufacturers to produce greater amounts of war materials. Following turbulent relationships between labor unions and factory managements during the 1930s, the atmosphere at the large factories was often tense. Directors of some large companies sought to minimize the friction and encourage a teamwork environment. In response to a rumored public relations campaign by the United Auto Workers Union, General Motors, or GM, quickly produced a propaganda poster in 1942 showing both labor and management rolling up their sleeves, aligned toward maintaining a steady rate of war production. The poster read, "Together we can do it," and "Keep 'em firing." In creating such posters, corporations wished to increase production by tapping popular pro-war sentiment, with the ultimate goal of preventing the government from exerting greater control over factory production. J. Howard Miller was an American graphic artist. He painted posters during World War II in support of the war effort, among them this famous "We Can Do It" poster. In 1942, Miller was hired by Westinghouse Electric's Internal War Production Coordinating Committee to create a series of posters to display to the company's workers. The intent of the poster project was to raise worker morale, to reduce absenteeism, to direct workers' questions to management, and to lower the likelihood of labor unrest or a factory strike. Each of the more than 42 posters designed by Miller was displayed in the factory for 2 weeks, then replaced by the next one in the series. Most of the posters featured men. They emphasized traditional roles for men and women, and one of the posters pictured a smiling male manager with the words, "Any questions about your work? Ask your supervisor." No more than 1,800 copies of the "We Can Do It" poster were printed. It was not initially seen beyond several Westinghouse factories in East Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and the Midwest US, where it was scheduled to be displayed for 2 5-day work weeks starting Monday, the 15th of February, 1943. The targeted factories were making plasticized helmet liners soaked with micarta, a phenolic resin invented by Westinghouse. Mostly women were employed in this enterprise, which produced some 13 million helmet liners over the course of the war. The slogan, "We Can Do It," was probably not interpreted by the factory workers as empowering women alone. Before this poster, there had already been paternalistic posters promoting management authority, employee capability, and company unity, so the workers would most likely have understood the image to mean Westinghouse employees can do it, all working together. The upbeat image served as soft propaganda to boost employee morale and keep production from dropping. The badge on the "We Can Do It" worker's collar identifies her as a Westinghouse Electric plant floor employee. The pictured red, white, and blue colored clothing, the same colors as the US flag, was a subtle call to patriotism. Now, during World War II, the "We Can Do It" poster was never connected to the 1942 hit song "Rosie the Riveter" by Red Evans and John Jacob Lew, nor to the widely seen Norman Rockwell painting called "Rosie the Riveter" that appeared on the cover of the Saturday Evening Post on 29 May 1943. The Westinghouse poster was not associated with any of the women nicknamed Rosie who came forward to promote women working for war production on the home front. Rather, after being displayed for 2 weeks in February 1943 to some Westinghouse factory workers, it disappeared for nearly 4 decades. Other rosy images prevailed, often photographs of actual workers. The Office of War Information geared up for a massive nationwide advertising campaign to sell the war, but "we can do it" was not part of it. The term Rosie the Riveter was in fact first used in the song. It was recorded by numerous artists and it became a national hit. The song portrays Rosie as a tireless assembly line worker who earned the Production E, or Excellence in Production Award, by doing her part to help the American war effort. Rockwell's emblematic Rosie the Riveter painting was loaned by the Post to the US Treasury Department for use in posters and campaigns promoting war bonds. Following the war, the Rockwell painting gradually sank from public memory because it was copyrighted. In contrast, the lack of protection for the "we can do it" image is one of the reasons why it experienced a resurgence in later years. In 1982, it was reproduced in a magazine article, Poster Art for Patriotism's Sake, a Washington Post magazine article about posters in the collection of the National Archives. In subsequent years, the poster was reappropriated to promote feminism. Feminists saw it as an embodiment of female empowerment. The "we" was understood to mean "we women," uniting all women in a sisterhood fighting against gender inequality. This was very different from the poster's original use to control employees and to discourage labor unrest. As for Rosie the Riveter, the image inspired a social movement to which women quickly responded. Convinced that they had a patriotic duty to enter the workforce, and some claim that this movement forever opened the workforce for women, but others dispute that point, noting that many women were discharged after the war and their jobs were given to returning servicemen. These critics claim that when peace returned, few women returned to their wartime positions and instead resumed domestic vocations or transferred into sex-typed occupations such as clerical and service work. For some, World War II represented a major turning point for women as they eagerly supported the war effort, but other historians emphasize that the changes were temporary and that immediately after the war was over, women were expected to return to traditional roles of wives and mothers. A third group has emphasized how the long-range significance of the changes brought about by the war provided the foundation for the modern women's movement. Leila J. Rupp, in her study of World War II, wrote, "For the first time, the working woman dominated the public image. Women were riveting housewives and slacks, not mother domestic beings or civilizers." After the First World War, the traditional methods used to gain support from troops were becoming outdated. Speeches from officials were not enough to recruit soldiers or get public support for the military. We have seen already how the Nazis utilized film as an effective propaganda tool in Germany. Soon the US government also saw the effectiveness of film and thus became the medium of choice to convince US soldiers, recruits, and the public on why fighting was necessary. After the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941, American film director Frank Capra enlisted with the armed forces. He was already an established Hollywood director responsible for directing Academy Award-winning films. He was assigned to work directly under George Marshall, the Chief of Staff of the United States Army. Marshall felt that the Signal Corps, an army branch responsible for communications, was incapable of producing so-called sensitive and objective troop information films. So, shortly after meeting General Marshall, Capra viewed Leni Riefenstahl's Triumph of the Will, which he called a terrifying motion picture. According to Capra, Riefenstahl's film fired no gun, dropped no bombs, but as a psychological weapon aimed at destroying the will to resist, it was just as lethal. To counter this kind of propaganda, Capra made his primary focus the creation of one basic powerful idea that would spread and evolve into other related ideas. His goal, according to Capra himself, was to let the enemy prove to our soldiers the enormity of his cause and the justness of ours. By doing so, Capra wanted to rally the American public behind the task to both win the war and win the peace. He would compile enemy speeches, films, newsreels, newspaper articles with a list of the enemy's hostile actions. From this came Capra's 7-part Why We Fight series, produced by the US Department of War from 1942 to 1945. While it was originally written for exclusively the American soldiers to help them understand why the United States was involved in the war, it was later ordered by Roosevelt to be distributed for public viewing as well. At around the same time when the first of the Why We Fight films were being released, Capra began production on Know Your Enemy, Japan. Capra initially hired Joris Ivans to supervise the documentary. In his 20-minute preview, Ivans treated the Japanese as an open-minded people being led by Emperor Hirohito, who was portrayed as the villain. However, the US Army disapproved of Ivans' approach towards the Japanese and asked Capra to remove Ivans from the production. Alan Rivkin, one of the writers working on the script, commented that a large setback for the film's production was the realization that we couldn't call Hirohito a war criminal because we knew we had to deal with him later, and it threw us into a tailspin. That's why it took so long. The final cut of the film, compiled from footage obtained from newsreels, captured enemy film, fictional Japanese movies for historical background, and reenactment supervised by the War Department. The scriptwriters felt that Capra had lost direction in the film, with a strong desire to give the film racist overtones. However, unbeknownst to them, Capra's racist depictions were at the request of the US military. In January 1945, the film underwent a series of final revisions because the Department of Defense thought it still had too much sympathy for the Jap people. The film's main purpose was to maintain the fighting spirit of US military forces for the final push against the Japanese home islands, where resistance was expected to be the fiercest. Historian John W. Dower said that Know Your Enemy, Japan was a potpourri of most of the English-speaking world's dominant cliches about the Japanese enemy, including the crudest, most vulgar, and most blatantly racist, which captured the passions and presumptions that underlay not only the ferocity of clash in Asia and the Pacific, but also the sweeping agenda of reformist policies that the Allied powers subsequently attempted to impose upon defeated and occupied Japan. Ironically, Know Your Enemy, Japan was released on 9 August 1945, 3 days after the atomic bombing of the Japanese city of Hiroshima, and the same day as the Nagasaki bombing. Therefore, the film's propaganda value was made redundant. When it became clear Japanese surrender was becoming a reality, American foreign policy in the Pacific rapidly switched from war to negotiation. In response, the US Supreme Commander, Southwest Pacific Area, General Douglas MacArthur, decided that the film should not be shown to all military personnel in the Pacific Theater, as was previously planned, because now there was no war. So, this kind of propaganda was pointless. He also recommended that it should be withheld from public release. On the 19th of December 1941, Roosevelt signed Executive Order 8985, which established the Office of Censorship and conferred on its director the power to censor international communications in his absolute discretion. The Office of Censorship was an emergency wartime agency set up to aid the censorship of all communications coming into and going out of the United States, including its territories and the Philippines. The Office of Censorship had to balance the protection of sensitive war-related information with the constitutional freedoms of the press. Its implementation of censorship was done primarily through a voluntary regulatory code that was willingly adopted by the press. Radio broadcasts, newspapers, and newsreels were the primary ways Americans received their information about World War II. Through the Office of Censorship, The American public was screened from the horrors of the Pacific War by sanitized images. Reality was restricted so as not to dampen war enthusiasm on the home front. Adams notes that the American public themselves often tried to block out the war's harsher aspects. For example, when a plastic surgery hospital in California allowed disfigured servicemen to go into the town of Pasadena, residents there demanded that those men be kept out of sight. Similarly, American citizens angrily criticized the military for releasing pictures of American corpses on Buena Beach as well as during the Battle of Tarawa in November 1943. Now, this photo showing 3 dead American soldiers was taken by photojournalist George Strock somewhere between the 31st of December 1942 and the 2nd of January 1943. Strock was assigned by Life magazine to cover the war in the Pacific. Strock's coverage of the Battle of Buena Gorna was initially published by Life on the 15th and the 22nd of February 1943. The publication included pictures of US soldiers on the battlefield and images of dead Japanese soldiers. But images that Strock took of dead American soldiers were not published because the US Office of Censorship prohibited their use. Up until that time, the US Office of Censorship only permitted the media to publish images of blanket-covered bodies and flag-draped coffins of dead US soldiers, partly due to the fact that the officials feared that Americans would be demoralized if they had any graphic understanding of the human cost. The government also restricted what reporters could write, and coverage was generally upbeat and bloodless. Life's Washington correspondent Cal Whipple felt that Strock's photograph was needed to inject a dose of reality on the home front, whom he thought were growing complacent about the war effort. Elmer Davis, director of the Office of War Information, believed that the American public had a right to be truthfully informed about the war within the dictates of military security. Davis asked President Roosevelt to lift the ban on publishing photographs of dead American soldiers on the battlefield. Roosevelt agreed and authorized the publication of Strock's image. Censorship was loosened, but the media was still forbidden from showing the faces of the dead or the insignia of the units they belonged to. Life finally published Strock's photograph on the 20th of September 1943. Strock's image was the first photograph to depict American soldiers dead on the battlefield since the attack on Pearl Harbor. The photo was accompanied by a full-page editorial explaining why the editors felt the image merited publication. It read, "Why print this picture, anyway, of 3 American boys dead upon an alien shore? Is it to hurt people? To be morbid? Those are not the reasons. The reason is that words are never enough. Well, this is the picture. And the reason we print it now is that last week President Roosevelt and Elmer Davis and the War Department decided that the American people ought to be able to see their own boys as they fall in battle, to come directly and without words into the presence of their own dead. This is the reality that lies behind the names that comes to rest at last on monuments in the leafy squares of busy American towns. The camera doesn't show America, and yet here on the beach is America, 3 parts of 130 million parts, 3 fragments of that life we call American life, 3 units of freedom, so that it is not just these boys who have fallen here. It is freedom that has fallen. It is our task to cause it to rise again." The image was republished on the cover of Yank, the US Army News Weekly, on the 5th of November 1943. They proclaimed that the photograph was necessary to give the over-optimistic and complacent American public a more realistic picture of the war. Unsurprisingly, the image provoked considerable controversy. Some readers criticized Life for exposing the public to more information about the war than they were prepared for, or for engaging in morbid sensationalism. While the picture improved war bond sales, it negatively affected enlistments. While there were attempts to erase or censor reality, other parts of reality were overemphasized or exaggerated to improve the image of the military. For this purpose, the US Armed Forces employed masses of public relations officers and advertising agencies. MacArthur was a notorious publicity seeker. During the first months of 1942, when the Japanese were overrunning his defenses in the Philippines, MacArthur still found the time to publish 140 press releases. In one 2-year period, he proudly reported 200,000 enemy killed for only 122 Allied killed. When he was driven from the Philippines, MacArthur's press staff manufactured the seemingly spontaneous line, "I shall return." When he did come back, the dramatic scene of him wading ashore was shot repeatedly on different beaches to achieve the best effect. Now, this photograph should look familiar to you, as we discussed it briefly in the first lecture of this course. The photo was taken by Joe Rosenthal and published under the caption "Raising Old Glory," or today more commonly known as "Raising the Flag on Iwo Jima." The image depicts US Marines hoisting the flag on Mount Suribachi, Iwo Jima, on the 23rd of February 1945. The Battle of Iwo Jima, 19 February to 26 March 1945, was a major battle in the Pacific War in which the United States Marine Corps and Navy landed on and eventually captured the island of Iwo Jima from the Japanese army. The purpose of the invasion, codenamed Operation Detachment, was to capture the island with its 2 airfields. The Japanese positions on the island were heavily fortified. The US ground forces were supported by extensive naval artillery and a complete air supremacy provided by the US Navy and Marine Corps aviators throughout the battle. The 5-week battle saw some of the fiercest and bloodiest fighting in the Pacific theater of World War II. Of the 21,000 Japanese soldiers on Iwo Jima at the beginning of the battle, only 216 were taken prisoner. The majority of the remainder were killed in action. In the end, the US suffered a total of 26,040 casualties, with 6,821 killed during the month-long battle. The invasion was controversial, as some strategists believed that the island was useless to the Army Air Force as a staging base, as well as useless to the Navy as a fleet base. It was also expected by US commanders before the battle that the island would be well defended and casualties would be significant. But Rosenthal's photo represented the climax of a long series of triumphant flag-raising images in American news coverage of the Pacific Theater. At first, these images of flags being raised on one island after the next increased the hopes of the US public for a relatively speedy end to the war. Indeed, the invasion of Iwo Jima had a special meaning for the American public. It was the first territory in the island-hopping campaign that was technically part of Japan. This then encouraged the press to say that the assault on Iwo Jima represented the beginning of the Battle of Japan, the final battle of the war in the Pacific. But the battle was far from the end. In fact, the US public were misled to believe that Rosenthal's picture signaled the end of the Battle of Iwo Jima. The image was taken only 4 days into the battle, and 3 out of the 6 Marines captured in the photo would be dead before its end. But the image was exactly what the public needed, a picture of inspiring heroism amidst the carnage. The press embellished the story a little more by claiming that the flag had been raised under heavy fire, establishing a myth that would carry on long after the war. The flag was also not even the first American flag to be raised in Iwo Jima. Earlier that day, a Marine platoon had been ordered to conduct a patrol to the summit of Mount Suribachi, which was the highest point of the island, and raise a US flag. Despite the large numbers of Japanese troops in the immediate vicinity, the patrol made it to the summit and raised the flag using Japanese water pipes. This photograph of the first flag flown on Mount Suribachi was taken by Staff Sergeant Louis R. Lowry of Leatherneck magazine, who accompanied the patrol up the mountain. The raising of a second flag was ordered to impress US Secretary of the Navy James Forrestal. It was photographed not only by Rosenthal, a civilian who worked for Associated Press, but also captured on this 16mm film by Sergeant Bill Gnaust, a US Marine photographer. When Rosenthal's photo was published, there were rumors that it had been staged by Rosenthal, but the film proved that it was genuine. Due to the impact that the photo had, government publicists saw the image as an opportunity to unite the US public behind the war effort. It was used as an advertising gimmick for the 7th War Loan, intended to stiffen America's faltering resolve to fight the war. For this purpose, the presumed 3 surviving flag raisers, Privates First Class Ira Hayes and Rene Gagnon, and Navy Corpsman John Bradley, were extricated from Iwo Jima to spearhead promotional efforts traveling across the country to participate in endless reenactments, press interviews, parties, etc. But being aware of the insignificance of the raising at the time, they were uneasy about being lauded as heroes. This unease may also have grown due to the fact that 2 of the survivors were not even in the photograph. While Hayes did indeed partake in the raising of the flag, recent investigations into the identity of the flag bearers have shown that neither Gagnon nor Bradley were actually in the picture. On 23 June 2016, the Marine Corps publicly announced that Marine Corporal, then Private First Class, Harold Schultz was actually one of the flag raisers and mistaken for Bradley. On the 16th of October 2019, the Marine Corps announced that Marine Corporal Harold Keller was the flag raiser previously identified as Gagnon. It is not clear why both Bradley and Gagnon did not come forward and admit that they were not part of the iconic photo, though perceived fame and pressure from the media may have played a role. Be that as it may, the 3 men helped to raise $26 billion during the 7th War Loan drive in 1945. The most enduring heroic war movies focused on ordinary soldiers, the Platoon. This genre began in the war to promote national solidity and suggest the vitality of a diverse democracy pitted against its enemies. Platoon movies portrayed American units as melting pots, excluding minorities, led by a tough professional sergeant. According to Adams, the iconic Platoon movie was Sands of Iwo Jima of 1949, starring famous American actor John Wayne as the hard sergeant Stryker, leading a band of young recruits from boyhood to manhood. Stryker was depicted as a towering figure in the heroic mold, the man with authority who had the courage to lead his men into harm's way. The tagline for the movie goes, "Alone and outnumbered, they had one thing in their favor, the American dream." Here again, we see how American exceptionalism is perpetuated in film, using the flag raising as a type of metaphor for being able to achieve anything under considerable odds. The movie also reinforced the myth of only one flag raising under enemy fire. The popularity of the image of the flag raising at Iwo Jima did not wane once the war ended. It was widely reproduced in the US, and in July 1945, the United States Postal Service released a postage stamp bearing the image, selling 137 million copies by 1948. The US issued another stamp in 1995, showing the flag raising as part of its 10-stamp series, marking the 50th anniversary of the end of World War II. In 2005, the United States Mint released a commemorative silver dollar bearing the image. In 1951, sculptor Felix de Welden and architect Horace W. Peasley were commissioned by the US Congress and Marine Corps League to design a memorial to the United States Marine Corps. The commission was part of an effort to protect the role and integrity of the Marines in a post-World War II world. De Welden was inspired by Rosenthal's photo and decided to replicate it in the form of a massive sculpture. He and his assistants spent 3 years creating a full-size model in plaster, with figures being almost 10 meters tall. The plaster model was disassembled and each piece was separately cast in bronze. The memorial was dedicated on the 10th of November 1954, which was the 179th anniversary of the founding of the Marine Corps. It is located in Arlington Ridge Park, overlooking the US capital city, Washington, D.C. It consists of front and rear inscriptions, and inscribed in gold letters around the polished black granite upper base of the memorial is the date and location of every United States Marine Corps major action up to the present time. The front, or west side, is titled Uncommon Valor was a Common Virtue, Semper Fidelis. The rear, or east side, is inscribed in honor and memory of the men of the United States Marine Corps who have given their lives to their country since the 10th of November 1775. The main marker reads, dedicated to the Marine dead of all wars and their comrades of other services who fell fighting beside them. Created by Felix de Weldon and inspired by the immortal photograph taken by Joseph J. Rosenthal on February 23, 1945 atop Mount Suribachi, Iwo Jima Volcano Islands. Erected by the Marine Corps War Memorial Foundation with funds provided by Marines and their friends, and with the cooperation and support of many public officials. Dedicated November 10, 1954. Following the end of the war, a slew of books by veterans were published criticizing how the war had been romanticized by Hollywood and the military. Some of these books, like Joseph Hiller's Catch-22 of 1961 and Kurt Vonnegut Jr.'s Slaughterhouse-5 of 1969, became so popular that they were adapted into film. Hiller depicted the strain on bomber crews led by callous generals obsessed with promotion. Vonnegut portrayed badly led, hapless, bewildered green soldiers taken prisoner in the Battle of the Bulge and bombed by their own side in Dresden. However, Adams notes that the dark humor seemed more appropriate to the Vietnam era than they were, and they were not taken seriously as World War II writers. As generations grew up unfamiliar with the 1940s, film became less accurate. By the late 1970s, the so-called baby boomers, or the generation of Americans born from those who lived and participated in the war, were now the current generation, with the so-called greatest generation of war veterans receding into the background as they got older. Living in a world more complex and difficult to handle, it became easy to project the 1940s as a golden age where everything seemed straightforward and worked out better. At a time when many ordinary Americans felt demoralized due to the failure of the Vietnam War, the Iranian hostage crisis, as well as an economic crisis, Ronald Reagan, a member of that greatest generation, took over the presidency and brought back pride with the fall of the Berlin Wall, the dismantling of the Soviet Union, and the end of the Cold War. Reagan was seen as the man who brought back American greatness. Americans saw themselves as custodians of democratic values and holders of the moral high ground. They could do no wrong. Reagan spent his military service during the war as a public relations officer for the US Army Forces, participating in war bond drives and acting in training films for the Air Force. Although Reagan did not actually fight in the war, the public bought the idea that he did, along with John Wayne. This embellishment caused African American writer James Baldwin to note that distorting history was now acceptable, so long as your message was sincere and avoided disturbing questioning. By the end of Reagan's second term as president in the late 1980s and early 90s, reverence for the war generation based on simplification of the 1940s had reached its zenith. In 1990, Memphis Belle, a feature film based on a 1943 documentary of a bomber aircraft's last mission over Germany, was made with the intent to glorify the actions of the American bomber crews who helped the world rid itself of tyranny and evil. The movie used special effects to suggest The plane survives unrealistic levels of damage, while the bomber crew, an adaptation of the traditional Platoon movie formula, perform astronomical feats of heroism in preposterous heroics. Yet, the reviews were good. The Cincinnati Enquirer said it was packed with true heroism and good old-fashioned patriotism. One of the stars of the film, Matthew Modine, was quoted as saying the heroics showed a kind of value that doesn't exist today. Today, there's a lot of shirking of responsibility. Modine's comments embody the increasing trend of associating praise of the greatest generation with criticism of subsequent generations. For the USA, World War II was a total victory, unlike the subsequent Korean and Vietnam Wars. Then, in 1990, Iraq invaded America's ally Kuwait, triggering the First Gulf War. Many Americans hoped that such a war would allow them to relive the era of a great triumph of the 1940s. The then US President George H.W. Bush was once again a member of the greatest generation and had actually fought in the Second World War. The conditions were ripe for the US to return to those so-called glorious days. The media called Iraqi dictator Saddam Hussein as a new Hitler, and US military commander Norman Schwarzkopf was compared to Britain's wartime leader Winston Churchill. Other media houses referred to Schwarzkopf as John Wayne, taking on the Iraqis. However, having carried out the United Nations mandate to drive the Iraqis from Kuwait, Bush took the decision to end the war without invading Iraq. But this limited victory did not leave everyone satisfied, especially those who wanted an out-and-out victory like in 1945. Those disappointed that the Gulf War had fallen short of realizing that dream of reliving the best war ever were left with a somber longing for an age they did not know nor experience themselves. When Bill Clinton was elected as US President in 1992, some detractors predicted that the achievements of Clinton's generation would pale in comparison with the World War II generation. This kind of criticism became typical of a growing trend among the baby boomers reaching middle age while their parents grew old. Those children who had rebelled in the 1960s against their parents, challenging the war in Vietnam and the government in general, came to regret their stance. It was under these circumstances that baby boomer filmmakers sought to pay tribute to the previous generation. As a result, a new cycle of World War II films that included Memphis Belle, as well as Saving Private Ryan of 1998, and the miniseries Band of Brothers of 2001 and The Pacific of 2010, were produced and were positively received both critically and at the box office. To keep with what Nicholas Cole calls the quest for moral certainty, filmmakers during this time kept the narrative used in wartime propaganda films as to why the war was good and just. For example, in Steven Spielberg's Saving Private Ryan, a squad of American soldiers led by the fatherly figure of Captain John Miller, played by Tom Hanks, are sent to find a young paratrooper behind enemy lines, whose three brothers had been killed in action following the Allied landings in Normandy, France. The squad, in the typical Platoon movie plot, goes out to find the paratrooper Private James Ryan, portrayed by Matt Damon, who is the only surviving sibling, and return him to his mother. The mission is absolutely implausible, as the military would not have deviated resources to rescue one man behind enemy lines, unless that person held strategic and tactical value. But the plotline is noble, and in that way it resonates with audiences, showing through the film how selfless soldiers from the greatest generation were to put their lives at risk to save another man's life. Thus, in these films the war is portrayed in an idealized way, emphasizing the US as the absolute moral power. In addition to the trend of in the type of film depicting the Second World War in the last decade of the 20th century, A resurgence in memorializing the greatest generation and the good war through monuments also took place. For example, the World War II Memorial in Washington, D.C. that opened in 2004 pays tribute to the veterans who served in the armed forces or as civilians during that war. The memorial is placed at the very center of the Capitol, which is testimony of what kind of impact the Second World War had in cementing national pride in the collective memory of Americans. The memorial and its placement confirms the ascendancy that the good war continues to enjoy, and how that war is utilized within what Patrick Finney describes as a vindicatory narrative of national history. In other words, it perpetuates the idea that the US are never the aggressors and always respond to the aggression, and when it does so, it usually triumphs because it has the moral impetus to do so. Criticism towards terms such as the greatest generation and the good war, or best war ever, has come from multiple sources, not least of which from within that generation itself. Rick Atkinson notes that the veterans are lionized as the greatest generation, an accolade none sought and many dismiss as twaddle. They are condemned to a sentimental hagiography in which all the brothers are valiant and all the sisters are virtuous. In addition, Paul Fussell correctly points out what has been celebrated as the greatest generation included among the troops and their officers plenty of criminals, psychopaths, cowards, and dolts. Brokaw is also criticized as clearly overstating the patriotism and pious devotion of the Depression generation. Yet, somehow his has become the prevailing view. It's also argued that the patriotism that supposedly dominated American life during World War II is a retrospective construct in an attempt to forget the horror of war. Kenneth D. Rose also warns that by hallowing the American participation in World War II, it does disservice to both the historical record and to the individuals themselves. By placing them on such a high pedestal based on a myth, it ignores the sacrifices made by the veterans of the other Allied countries, and when that myth is debunked, it discredits the experiences of the US veterans themselves. In conclusion, the function of the Good War myth was to counter a crisis of national identity that befell the US following its failure in the Vietnam War, seen as the Bad War. Following the election of Reagan in the 1980s, the myth was utilized as a means by which a renewed sense of national identity was repackaged. The purpose of the myth was to reconstruct the past so that the present generation could embrace a common vision, a singular identity of what it means to be a good citizen and share common values, what it is to be a good American, whatever that might be. Next time, we will continue with our discussion of the Good War, looking critically at racial representations of the Japanese by American propagandists during and immediately after the war, as well as representations of African American servicemen during the same period, and responses to such representation.